We've had a summer break from these news briefings. We've had a series of in conversation with over the summer with the various journalists that work for us. So this feels a bit like the kind of return of school back to business as usual. I'm very happy indeed to be welcomed by several key speakers today. So Professor Nick Hopkins, the Family Law Commissioner at the Law Commission, who is behind this report, will speak to it and explain it in more detail. Andrew Copson is with us, the Chief Executive of Humanists UK, who I think you could argue, Andrew, this might be considered a bit of a feather in your cap or a campaigning success, but no doubt you will fill us in with the details later. And the Reverend Bruce Hopkins, from the chairman of the Lincolnshire Bruce Thompson, beg your pardon, chair of the Lincolnshire Methodist District, who joins us, and various others will join the call and make contributions as we go. So without further ado, can I turn to you, Professor Hopkins, to start with?
Thank you.
So the proposal that you came up with last week, it garnered quite a bit of media coverage. I wonder if you could just start at the beginning for us and explain why it was felt that changes were needed in the marriage regulations.
Yeah, of course. So as many of those here today will be aware, the wedding law that we have was formed in 1836. And while there have been some piecemeal changes since then, the sort of fundamental structure of weddings law has not changed and has not been subjected to a wholesale review. And in essence, we have a law that is now out of date. It's a law that has restrictions on how and where people can get married that we would look at now and understand in a historical context, but question whether they have relevance to society today. Now, many of you will be aware that this isn't the first time the Law Commission has looked at weddings law. Back in December 2014, we were asked by government to undertake a scoping study. And as part of that study, not to come up with provisional proposals for reform, but to identify the issues that would need to be addressed if a law reform project was to go ahead. We concluded in that scoping paper that there was a need for wholesale reform, and that is what we suggested to government. There was then a period when government did not ask us to proceed to a full project, and indeed suggested that there were other priorities it wanted to pursue. But back in November 2018, in the budget, the Treasury announced that the Law Commission was being asked now to proceed to a full review of weddings law. We then agreed our terms of reference with government and began this project back in July last year. So what we have now published is a consultation paper. It contains provisional proposals and questions, and it is out for public consultation until the 3rd of December.
Thank you, that's very clear. What were the anomalies that you were seeking to address?
There are lots of anomalies around the different rules that apply to different types of weddings. So under the existing law, for example, there are different rules if a wedding is Anglican on the one hand, or if it is conducted according to the rites and usages of the Jewish or Quaker faith on the other hand, or conducted according to other religious beliefs on the other hand, or if it's a civil wedding, and then if it's a civil wedding in a registry office or on approved premises. So we have a very complex law, and a law that takes as a starting point the building or the venue in which the wedding is going to take place. It's a law that, as a result, imposes restrictions on where weddings can take place. For example, they can't generally take place outside because there is then no building to be the focus of regulation. So what I think we have is a classic example of law that has developed piecemeal without the opportunity to step back and consider what modern society needs as a coherent body of weddings law, to look at sort of each stage of the legal process, from the preliminaries, when notice is given, right the way through to registration.
One of the most eye-catching things you came up with was that you were going to, or the proposals would allow weddings to take place on beaches or up mountains.
Yes, and this is about giving couples choice to have a wedding that is meaningful to them. Now, for some people, that the wedding that's meaningful to them is a wedding that takes place in a place of worship, for example. But for others, being able to have a wedding in a place that has special significance for them would be far more meaningful. We know there's a demand because we know, for example, that weddings do take place outside at the moment, but they're not legally recognised. We also know that weddings take place outside in a number of other jurisdictions, from locations as exotic as Scotland and New Zealand, for example, and that the laws there work very well in terms of location. We don't think, or our provisional view is, that the law doesn't need to restrict where a wedding takes place, as long as the venue is safe, and as long as the wedding is going to be dignified.
And another thing that caught the headlines was your proposals would allow Humanist and other non-religious celebrants to conduct legally binding weddings. What was behind your thinking there?
Yeah, we have to be a little bit nuanced here. Under the terms of reference that we have agreed with government, we have not been asked to advise government or to make recommendations on whether humanists or independent celebrants should be able to conduct legally binding weddings. What government has asked us to do is provide a scheme that would enable those groups to perform legally binding weddings if they are enabled to do so. But that prior question, should humanists be able to marry people, should independent celebrants be able to marry people, is not a matter that is part of our review.
Well, I'm sure Andrew will say something about that in a moment, but just another question from me. You say that the proposals will ensure fewer weddings are conducted according to religious rites, which means that those marriages are not recognised in law. And I know there have been two cases that went to the Court of Appeal, I think, where women involved in marriages were anxious to be able to settle a divorce easily and found that their marriage was not recognised. Was that one of the key issues that caused your proposals to be created and formed in the first place?
Yes, that has certainly been one of the key concerns with the weddings law that we have at the moment, the incidence of religious-only weddings that are not legally recognised, and that the couple or one of the couple are not aware are not legally recognised. Now, we tackle that in our provisional proposals in different ways. So one is that under our proposals, it would be easier to have a religious wedding that is legally recognised. So, for example, not every religion looks at the place of worship as the logical place to hold a wedding. And at the moment, a religious wedding has to take place in a place of worship that is registered for weddings. So under our provisional proposals, if a religion would like wedding ceremonies to take place outside of the place of worship, that would be possible. Additionally, we propose that there shouldn't be any requirement of prescribed words in a ceremony, which is another issue, that the prescribed words that are required don't fit neatly within the wedding ceremonies of a number of religions. So taking away the need to kind of try and superimpose those words means that a wedding ceremony that is within the rich tradition of a religion, and that takes place in a venue that the religion is happy for that wedding to take place, could be legally recognised. We also, just very briefly say, we also look at the circumstances in which a religious wedding that does not comply with formality should be considered void rather than a non-qualifying ceremony. Under our proposals, it would be more likely that the wedding would be void. That's significant because where a wedding is void, the court can provide financial relief on the breakdown, whereas if a wedding is non-qualifying, then financial relief is not available.
Thank you. And I know we've got Hassan on the call, who I'm sure will come back on that question. You mentioned that the ritual, the words may change in a wedding that may take place in a boudoir or with people of faiths other than Christianity. What are the key clauses that people won't have to say to each other anymore?
Yeah, so at the moment, again, it's an area where the rules differ according to the type of wedding. So there are no requirements in terms of what is said in an Anglican wedding or a wedding according to the usages of Jews or Quakers. But for all other religious weddings and for civil weddings, there are prescribed words. So that includes, for example, you saying that there is no lawful impediment to your marriage. Now, in fact, that's something that is checked and that should be checked at the notice stage. If there's an impediment to your marriage, you shouldn't be standing ready to get married. So what we provisionally propose is that there should be no requirements as to the form or content of the ceremony, so no prescribed words. The only requirement that would be present is that the couple must express their consent to being legally married. But that expression of consent could be a verbal expression. It could be by their actions. So, for example, for some religions, it's the placing of the ring on the finger, or it is taking part in a particular ritual that is understood as the expression of that consent, or it may be the signing of the wedding schedule, so the replacement for the wedding certificate, which would say that the couple are or have consented to being legally married.
Well, thank you very much. That was a long explanation, very grateful for clarity there. Thank you, Nick. Can we go to Andrew Copson next, Chief Executive of Humanist UK? Would you agree, Andrew, that this is a triumph in your campaigning, that you've won this?
No, probably not, actually. I mean, although these proposals do include the possibility of a government that accepted them, thereby giving legal recognition to humanist marriage, we've said for many decades that the process is actually much simpler than that. Ever since 2013, there has been a category of marriage in England and Wales called marriage according to the usages of non-religious belief organisations. And all the government needs to do to bring humanist marriage into being in England and Wales is to lay an order under that statute. And we would far prefer them to do that rather than to defer the matter to some future wholesale reform of marriage, which may not happen. I mean, there's no disservice to Nick, I think, to point out that the majority of Law Commission recommendations have not been implemented in this country. That's just a statistical fact. So for our part, we would prefer, obviously, humanist marriage to be given legal recognition now, and if not now, then as soon as possible. I think I'll probably be agnostic about the remaining proposals that the Law Commission scheme lays out. But I think it will probably be extremely controversial to have a scheme of marriage in England and Wales that allows commercial celebrants to conduct legal marriages. It's not something that happens elsewhere in the UK. It's very rare in Europe. And I think that sort of deregulation or part privatisation or commercialisation, whatever you want to call it, in terms of marriage that is that is present in the Law Commission's possible scheme, I think would be quite controversial. And I wouldn't want to see that controversy delaying or deferring the introduction of humanist marriage, which is not controversial and exists already in the UK, in Northern Ireland and in Scotland, where it's incredibly popular.
I don't understand what you've been talking about there as the commercialisation of wedding celebrants as contained in the proposals. What do you mean exactly?
So the Law Commission proposals, Nick called them independent. I don't know quite what that means because I don't know who they're independent of. But what he's talking about is people who operate them, who sell their services to conduct weddings, and they sort of design whatever wedding you want with different elements. The proposals that the Law Commission has put forward would incorporate them into a future scheme of marriage by authorising them to conduct marriages.
But at the moment, you would pay, I mean, your humanist celebrants would be paid for doing a funeral, for example.
So there are laws around profit and gain, for example, in Scotland and similarly in Northern Ireland, that would restrict the activities as they're restricted to religious conductors of marriages, to being able to sort of reasonably charge for their time or do, of course, weddings for free, as some of our celebrants do in some circumstances. And what's different in the proposals, as I understand it, and it's many hundreds of pages, I've only read it a couple of times, is that there would be no similar restrictions on commercial celebrants who'd be authorised to conduct marriages.
Nick, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, I will do. Thank you, just for clarification, and I might also kind of quibble slightly, Andrew, with your statistic about our implementation, in that around 2/3 of our reports have been implemented in whole or in part. So I agree that there's no guarantee, but our implementation rate is very good, and government now has to say there's a serious intention to take forward reform in order for us to start a project. So I say that purely by means of highlighting that the prospects of our recommendations being taken forward are I would hope, very good. We have been asked to provide a scheme that could accommodate humanists and independent celebrants, but I don't think there's any suggestion, and there certainly isn't in our consultation paper, that those two groups have to be treated together, or indeed that the issues in relation to those groups are the same. So in the case of humanist celebrants, for example, we, as Andrew was kind of alluding to elsewhere, we assume that the same provision around profit would apply as would apply to a religious officiant. So in other words, a celebrant would of course be able to charge for the service that they're providing, but not in a way that puts that profit over their belief, whether that belief is a religious one or a humanist or non-religious belief. We do highlight in that respect that if government were to decide that independent celebrants should be able to conduct legally binding weddings, and by independent we mean a celebrant who is not connected to a religious or non-religious body, then that would mean enabling celebrants to conduct weddings who may be motivated more by profit, who would be able to make a profit from their activities, but not in a way that represented a conflict of interest. There would be some limitation there, but we do accept that in terms of commercialisation, the issues relating to independent celebrants are different from the issues relating to sort of religious and non-religious officiants.
Thank you, Nick. Andrew, if I could just come back to you to just broaden this out a bit, that do you think that this relaxation of the laws, allowing people to get married on beaches and a wider variety of people performing the ceremony and words that are used, is a further nail in the coffin, if you like, for the future of weddings in religious settings?
Well, of course, it's been the case now for quite some time that most marriages contracted in England and Wales are not contracted in a religious form, so I'm sure that with greater flexibility around the location of civil marriage, couples will be more and more likely to choose a civil marriage option or a commercial marriage if these proposals go through. But certainly, I think that that is the case. I don't think that's a problem. I mean, it makes civil marriages a lot more like humanist marriages, of course, because it moves civil marriage away from being simply something that you conduct with a state registrar in a particular place because you're not having a religious marriage, to being something that in their own right, as wedding ceremonies are bespoke and personalised and so on and so forth. And so I think it's a victory for the humanist approach to things in a broader sense, because marriage becomes about the individual people involved, the place is significant to them, the ceremony tailored to their particular worldview. Yeah, and it's bound to lead to a reduction in religious marriages, I would think, just as the introduction of approved premises outside of register offices led to the big slump that we saw away from religious weddings. You know, when other beautiful places became available, it turned out that what people wanted were beautiful places, and that they weren't particularly attached.
I was looking that up before, the ONS stats, which I don't fully understand this. They came out in 2019, but they were stats relating to 2016, unless someone on the call proves me wrong at this point. There were about 250,000 marriages in England and Wales. 24% were in religious settings, which was very low, an all-time low.
The big drop off on religious weddings came when the law was changed to allow civil weddings to take place in settings outside of register offices. And at that point, when those attractive venues became available, it turned out that that's what people wanted. I mean, for my part, I think that people who have a particular religion or belief system should always be able to have, in this country, a legal marriage based on their religion or belief system. And that, obviously, the proposals that Law Commission is making won't change that for religious people. They will always be able to have that. But I suppose...
Why do you think that, Andrew? Why do you think that?
This is speaking personally. I mean, I must say, Humanist UK's policy is obviously limited to the pursuit of legal humanist marriages, and doesn't have a wider view. My own personal belief, however, is that marriage, the married state, the decision of two people to make a commitment to each other, is something that precedes the laws and regulations that have grown up around it in this country and in all countries, and that as a result, the business of the state is in recognising this commitment that's been made and making it possible for it to occur. And I think, therefore, that it's right for people's particular preferences in relation to their worldviews or their religions or beliefs to be taken into account when the state is doing that job of recognising marriage. There is an alternative, of course. The alternative is that you could have a French-style system where just everyone has a secular civil registration and is free to have their own more meaningful ceremony along, after that. That's not the point to which history has brought England and Wales on, though. No. So in that context, I think that it's right for the state to just try and recognise, as the Law Commission's recommendations do actually, the existing commitments of individuals when they decide they want to embark on their married life together. And I think that's what we should have.
Marvellous, thank you. Can we go to the Reverend Bruce Thompson now? You're chair of the district of the Lincolnshire district of the Methodist Church. Bruce, how do you reflect on what you've heard so far? And is there anything that Andrew has said that you disagree with?
Well, thank you, Ruth, and thank you to Professor Hopkins for the report. I have to say that I'm not here to defend the church or fight any assault on the Christian understanding of marriage. I don't see this as a threat to the church in any shape or form. The church doesn't have a monopoly on faith or belief or even love. If there are to be weddings on a beach, I wouldn't want the church to be seen as some form of modern day King Canute, trying to hold it all back. The vast majority of the people who want to get married would not understand some of the nuances that we're considering today. They just want an experience that resonates with them, a spiritual, if not a religious form. They want positive memories. Now, Andrew's correct that there was a big drop in church weddings when other premises became authorised to conduct a wedding. I remember it very well, but I'm not entirely sure there will be as big a drop in church weddings this time round as there was on that occasion. I think we've already reached the point where only, if you like, the very keen will seek out a church wedding, and they will continue to do that whether there are greater options, a greater number of options elsewhere or not. I'm especially pleased that faiths other than my own and beliefs other than my own and practices that I'm personally accustomed to, other practices will be as valued by the state, by the law, as Christian marriages if these proposals go through. I think it's reflective of modern day society, and I think we've been holding back for far too long. So I hope Andrew would understand that I'm sort of leaning towards him in that respect. I'm sorry that he doesn't feel that it's, sort of fulfills all his desires, but I think it's a huge step forward, and it's about time too.
Do you not feel threatened in any way that that this represents a further kind of demise of the religious affiliation in this country, the future of faith, greater secularization? Do you not feel that the future of the church is threatened in any way by a development like this?
Well, I think it depends what you mean by faith, actually. I don't see it as an assault on faith per se or belief per se. I think we've ended up with a secular church in a spiritual age. I don't think we've managed to grasp the zeitgeist of the period. I think people are very sort of spiritual, and I think this particular approach will reflect that. I think it's down to the church to be a little bit more attractive than it has been. We've all been to church services, church weddings, where there's, goodness me, where the building's been poorly lit, it's dusty and it's cold, with a service that's failed to speak to a congregation, with an organist having a very poor attempt at "Here Comes the Bride," and the officiant mumbling a half-hearted welcome. And we should be asking ourselves if we've been doing as good a job as we ought to have been doing in conducting weddings. One of the reasons why people have turned away from the church to experience a wedding elsewhere. Yes, we've had restrictions placed upon us. Of course we have. We have to conduct the wedding according to our own recognised rights. But some of us haven't always been as welcoming as we might have been. Some of us have hidden behind the protocols and used them as an excuse for not being as imaginative or as creative with the service as some couples might have hoped. So I don't see this as a threat at all. I think the church is big enough. I think Christianity is big enough. And I think faiths other than my own are big enough to cope with some of the challenges that we face.
So really what you're saying is it's a challenge in a way to faith institutions in this country to open up what they're doing to a wider clientele, if you like. I mean, I just wonder if you know anything about the use of redundant churches, where the building may be maintained by an organisation that's not affiliated to the organised church, but it's still run, and responsibility lies with the local parish priest or minister, whatever it may be. And I wonder if you have any reflections on how those redundant churches could maybe be used more than they are being at the moment by outward-looking churches to encourage people to come in, whatever their beliefs.
Absolutely, I agree wholeheartedly. I don't see why redundant churches shouldn't be used. You know, I'm very liberal on these matters. Obviously, there are restrictions in place due to the deeds and so on, the rules that are placed on the sale of that building and its use thereafter. But, you know, I think we should open ourselves up a lot more than we have done. I don't believe in a colonial church anymore. I think we have to recognise that we are not alone in this world. As I said, we do not have a monopoly on faith or belief. We do not have a monopoly on love. We do not have a monopoly on what people believe constitutes marriage. So I think it's incumbent upon us as to see that we see this as an opportunity rather than a threat, to actually look at ourselves. For too long, I think we've expected people to come to us instead of us go to others. I sometimes say to my congregations, you know, let's have the church doors open, not so that people can come in, but so that we can get out. And I think if we did that much more, then I think the relationship between the wider community and the faith community, be that church or a faith other than Christianity, would be that much more resonant with what is going on today. I mean, many churches have taken great strides in terms of making the buildings more welcoming, more light, and being more imaginative with their services. But I think we could go a lot further, and I think this will. And also, I always remember a neighbour who wanted to get married and wanted me to conduct the service at a hotel. Well, of course, I wasn't permitted to do that. So the legal side of things was done whilst I was kept out of the room, deliberately so that there was no confusion. And they weren't happy about this, but they didn't want to get married in church, and they had good reasons for not getting married in a Christian building. But they also wanted a Christian service of kind, but not in a church building. There were very good reasons for not doing so. But I was kept out until the legal bit was done, and then I was brought in as a kind of addendum. And I think this, Nick, Professor Hopkins might tell me I'm wrong, but I think this would provide the opportunity for me to relate to that neighbour in a far better way should that experience come again.
Is that right, Professor Hopkins?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I give sort of reassurance in the sense that religions would still be able to set the rules as to where their weddings could take place. So if a religion said that its weddings had to take place in the church, then that would still remain the case. But we do, for example, suggest that it should be possible to have more religious content in a civil ceremony. And that would stop some of the concerns, and Reverend Thompson's experience there is not unique, unfortunately, to what we've heard, where the provision at the moment that says that you can only have incidental content, incidental religious content in the civil ceremony, is sometimes interpreted in a very strict way. And sometimes interpreted to mean that religious officials who are going to be part of a separate ceremony shouldn't be there, or that there needs to be that very strict separation between the legal civil part of the wedding and a religious celebration that follows it. So our proposals would allow much greater integration, and that would result in the couple having a service that is much more meaningful to them, being legally recognised.
Thank you, Nick. Can I go to Usama Hassan, who's on the call? I don't know if this is your question, Usama, but it would be good to pick up the point that we heard earlier from Professor Hopkins about the challenges and the legal setting and meaning of Islamic marriages in particular. Just do please make your point.
Yes, thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Professor Hopkins and Andrew. And so this is of great interest to me and many of my Muslim colleagues, because stats seem to show that of all the religious organizations, Muslims tend to value, or not value, but they often have the religious ceremony, which is called the nikah, the Islamic wedding blessing, before the legal registration. And in fact, often the legal registration doesn't happen, and that causes the problem which I think you alluded to, of of property rights or financial rights afterwards if the marriage breaks down. And just a couple of questions there actually in terms of the proposals, and I hope to make a submission to the Law Commission's consultation, although it's very long. And that is largely around independent celebrants. I think that will be of a lot of interest for a couple of reasons, and which is related to the fact that generally in Islamic thinking, a wedding can be done anywhere. It's often done in the mosque and is preferred often to be done in the mosque, but it's not strictly necessary. So, I mean, I've done countless nikah blessings in people's homes or in private hotel rooms. I've also done joint wedding blessings with a Christian priest, friends of mine, for joint Muslim-Christian weddings, and that's where interfaith weddings comes into it, which is related to my point actually, which is that there are 2,000 mosques in this country, permanent mosques roughly, and not a single one will actually bless a marriage of a Muslim woman to a non-Muslim man, and also not a single one will has female registrars to do wedding blessings. Now there are kind of part-time mosques, if you like the Inclusive Mosque and possibly the Bradford Muslim Women's Mosque, which may be exceptions to that rule, but out of 2,000, that's not very much. So I think the requirement to be part of a religious body may cause problems for people involved in interfaith marriages, and also Muslim women who may wish to become celebrants. And I'll put that into the submission if I'm able to make that. I think the independent celebrants will be very important because mosques are being registered as places of marriage, and we need to increase that. But there are much wider issues out there. But again, I'd like to thank everybody involved with this, helping to overhaul the laws on marriage in this country, which I do believe are long overdue. And actually, I would support Andrew's idea of a quick stopgap measure, which you mentioned, based on the 2013 measures, but also later wholesale reform of the marriage law. Sorry, it's a number of points there.
No, thanks, Osama. Yeah, can I bring in Andrew Brown at this point, who I think has reported on this in the past, and the business of void marriages being very important.
Yes, I wasn't quite clear from what Nick said whether there was whether there is in these recommendations any treatment of the concept of void marriages, especially where Islamic marriages are concerned. There was a court case a couple of years back in which a judge decided that a 17-year-long marriage between two Muslims, which had never been civilly registered, had only been religious, while it couldn't be counted as a proper marriage, so to say, in English law, could be counted as a void one, which meant that the wife was entitled to financial support, even if she wasn't a wife, if you see what I mean. And this was, it seemed to me at the time, a very creative use of the law to try and ensure that women were not shortchanged deliberately or otherwise by not understanding the difference in British law between civil and religious marriage. And do these recommendations address that problem head on? Do indeed the panel think that this is a sensible way to go about that problem?
Yeah, well, over to you, Nick.
Yes, one of the difficulties with the current law, one of the criticisms of it, is that there are a number of requirements imposed in the legislation, but it's not always clear what the consequence of not complying with those requirements are. And so one of the things we want to do is make it clearer when a wedding will be void or voidable, or when a wedding will be non-qualifying. Under the proposals that we put forward, it will be far more likely that a wedding that doesn't comply with the legal requirements is void rather than non-qualifying, and so the financial relief would be available. So, for example, under our proposals, even if no notice has been given, as long as one of the couple believe that the officiant is authorised, the wedding will be void rather than non-qualifying. So to some extent, we do tackle the issue that Andrew has raised head on, but we do recognise that there are limits. We recognise that there are circumstances where it is right that a wedding should be treated as non-qualifying, and that the financial remedies available on a divorce should not therefore be available. That would be the case, for example, if not only had the couple not given notice, but neither of them believe that the officiant is authorised to conduct a legally binding wedding. Or the couple don't give notice and there is no officiant, but they make some commitment to each other. Now, that doesn't mean that we think that in those circumstances there shouldn't be a legal remedy. It means we think there's a limit to how far weddings law should be applicable here. There are lots of circumstances where a couple have a relationship which they think is legally recognised, but which is not in fact legally recognised. There is still the so-called myth of common law marriage, where a lot of people who have cohabited without any kind of ceremony believe wrongly that the fact that their cohabitation has continued for a particular length of time means that the law will treat them as being married. We think in those circumstances, the correct response is not to look to weddings law and say that there is a marriage of some description, even of a void marriage, but the correct remedy is to look more widely at how the law treats couples who are not married on the breakdown of their relationship. And a number of years ago, the Law Commission did publish recommendations for reform of financial relief at the end of a cohabitation relationship. And no, sadly, they do fall within the category that Andrew is flagging of Law Commission reports that have not yet been implemented.
Thank you again, Nick, for that explanation. So we have two contributions now. Could we go to Amanda Hancock's first and then Lois Lee, please?
Hi, I've just got a question for you, Nick, really, just picking up something you're saying about language. So it's the experience of a lot of people that registrars are quite hot on not allowing any form of religious language in a registry office marriage. So are one of your proposals that should be scrapped now? And so if you did want to have any form of religious language or sections from the Bible or whatever you wanted, that the registrars would have to allow that to happen?
Yes, that's right. So essentially our proposal puts the emphasis the opposite way round to where it is at the moment. So where it is at the moment is that religious content is not permitted unless it's incidental. And as you say, that means readings from holy books aren't permitted, for example. Under our proposals, you would be allowed religious content in a civil wedding as long as the ceremony was still essentially a civil ceremony. So what you wouldn't be able to do, for example, is ask the civil registrar to conduct a wedding that is essentially an Anglican service or a Jewish service, for example. But as long as it's still essentially a civil wedding, then religious content would be permitted.
Thank you. That okay, Amanda? No supplementaries. So Dr. Lois Lee from the University of Kent. I wonder if you'd like to contribute now.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Ruth. Yes, so I'm a sociologist working on religion, but also specialising in non-religious populations. And so from that perspective, I suppose I would just broadly welcome the recommendations. I think they are really overdue. I'd emphasise what Andrew said, that civil ceremonies became the most popular form of marrying in this country in 1977. It's such a long time ago. So having some parity in the law is definitely overdue. I think that's where we're at with the research, is a much stronger recognition that the non-religious have existential and metaphysical beliefs that are in many ways equivalent to religious beliefs, and that's being recognised in all sorts of areas of public life, education and so on. And this is obviously a very important area in which that's relevant. So I think that should be recognised in our law, but also I think the recommendations address the fundamental asymmetry, the kind of disparity between the way we conceive of and treat religious and non-religious people, which I think is very problematic in terms of equalities and discrimination law and so on and so forth. So just to pick up on that, the point we were just discussing about being able to include religious material in a civil ceremony, that addresses a really fundamental asymmetry in the law, that in a religious ceremony you could, at least in theory, include whatever non-religious cultural material you wanted to. You could turn to humanist writings and draw on those and include those as readings and so on, but as it stands, you couldn't include any religious material, any religious music and so on. Well, as you say, you're allowed to in some ways, but in practice it's often very clearly excluded, and there's certainly lots of material that is excluded, and that I think is fundamentally strange, unequal, but also I think causes problems if we're thinking more broadly about social cohesion issues and so on. It sort of stands in the way of the kind of cultural exchange that we tend to want to encourage in most parts of our cultural life. So I think for all of those different reasons, the recommendations are really good. It's helpful hearing the discussion and thinking about some of the nuance in them, but I think that they're so important and very successful in lots of ways and very much in keeping with what people want. I think the balance between including non-religious organisations but also very carefully thought through scope for independent celebrants is important as well, because the role of religious and non-religious organisations is changing in lots of ways. I think they will always continue to have a role, and that in practice individuals often want guidance and a sense of legitimacy in marriage ceremonies and so on. So I think they will have an important role to play, and if these recommendations were brought into law, I think we would see that both areas would be enlivened and rejuvenated and grow in some ways. But I think having the opportunity for people to think about that and to explore other options is important in a situation in which most people are not members of either religious or non-religious organisations, and yet we know that the numbers of people who want to marry and do marry is extraordinarily buoyant. You know, we always thought that secularisation would lead to the impoverishment of our ritual life, and that hasn't happened. We have seen a decline overall in the number of people who want to marry, but it's not a huge decline. There are still hundreds of thousands of people who do want to, and there's a question about whether the decline of religion and secularisation is what impoverishes our our ritual life, or whether it's actually our legal situation at the moment that leads to that impoverishment. So yeah, I think it's
that's interesting. So the Law Commission may be responsible for buoyancy and spirituality, Lewis. I don't know if that's the best way to paraphrase what you're saying. What's going on?
I'm happy with that, apart from spirituality, because lots of the people I work with in my research aren't sure about that word. If they see themselves as non-religious, that language doesn't always work, but they do have worldviews, they do have existential and metaphysical beliefs, and I think having opportunities to explore that publicly is certainly something these recommendations would facilitate. But
right. There you are. That's a very I don't know, Nick, how you're responding to that, but anyway, come back to us a bit later with a spin-off of your report. Two more questions. So if we could go back to Amanda now and then to Isalda for another question. So Amanda first.
Okay. Nick, I just have one more question, which was just about independent celebrants.
Yes.
Are they going to be, will they need to register, or will there be some form of regulation? Because you know, the whole wedding industry is financially very lucrative. And if there were to be independent celebrants who set up their own websites, they can go anywhere they want and they can advertise that they'll give you the fantastic day, Are they just going to be allowed free reign, or will there be some form of regulation that people know they're getting value for money and also they're actually getting a genuine experience?
Yeah, thank you. That's a significant point, because under our proposed scheme, the focus of regulation is placed on the officiant rather than the building at the moment. And we have a number of different categories of officiants. So in the case of religious bodies, for example, and non-religious organisations, they would be able to nominate officiants either by name or by office holder. And all Church of England sort of clergy and holy orders would be officiants as well. So we have a number of different categories. We have the Anglican clergy, we have nominated officiants, we have registrars, we have maritime officiants for weddings at sea, and then we have sort of independent officiants. They would have to be registered with the GRO, the General Registrar Office. They would have to meet certain requirements, including being sort of fit and proper persons to act as officiants. They would be subject to financial constraints in the sense that they would not be able to act in a conflict of interest. So they would not be able to say, for example, well, no, yes, I'll conduct your wedding for you as long as you buy these additional services that I will also be providing. So a different form of financial regulation, and that would apply to officiants nominated by religions or non-religious organisations, but some financial regulation, but there would be a registration system for all officiants.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I just ask one thing about?
Yeah.
And so if you if you did have somebody who had registered, but actually they didn't do a very good job or whatever, would there be a means of the couple being able to make a complaint or claim against that person or anything like that?
Ultimately, it would be possible to have that person struck off as not being fit and proper. Beyond that, I mean, in the case of independent celebrants, there may well be sort of civil law contractual disputes that arose with the couple and the officiant if what they thought they were being provided with, they were not in fact being provided with.
Thank you.
So it would, sorry, I suppose it would in effect be a mix of regulation and usual sort of civil law remedies.
Thank you. And Usama, another very quick question.
Yeah, thank you. A very quick question to Professor Hopkins again, actually. You mentioned the wording. Now, again, within the Muslim community, we have different schools of jurisprudence, etc., and they kind of differ on the precise conditions for marriage. But the general agreement is it comes down to consent, boils down to consent, and making it public through notification or a minimum of 2 witnesses, for example. And so it would seem to me that if that is the case for other religious traditions as well as non-religious ones, then that bare minimum kind of idea of consent, whether written or verbal, or of course, some people are not able to speak, sign language or signing a piece of paper, thumbprint, and possibly also making it public in various ways. The 2 witnesses is the standard Islamic practice as it is in the civil register offices. So, I mean, is that a survey you've done, or is that what you're planning to do through the consultation?
Well, yeah, we're not conducting a specific survey as such. Be very interested to hear your thoughts through the consultation. But under the proposals we put forward, essentially, as long as a religion accepts something as a wedding ceremony, then that would be a sufficient ceremony, as long as part of that, the couple express their consent to being legally married. Our kind of backstop, to use that word for that, is that if a religion doesn't want to identify a particular point of the service that reflects the consent, or that is the marker of the couple's consent, then the couple signing the wedding schedule would be their consent to legal marriage. So essentially what we want to be able to do is say to religions that your religious ceremony that you see within your faith as marking a couple becoming married would be recognised in law as them becoming legally married. And the same for a non-religious belief organisation, that the ceremony that they wanted to be recognised as a marriage would be recognised in law as a marriage.
Yeah, thank you. A quick follow-up. It just strikes me that's a good way of having a kind of almost approaching a universal approach to marriage, which kind of unites British citizens, if you like. I think that's something good.
It is. Thank you. I mean, essentially, what it does is it puts all religions and potentially all non-religious belief organisations in the same position that's held by Jews and Quakers at the moment. In that there's no regulation, there's nothing that says what the ceremony has to consist of. You go through your civil preliminaries. You have a wedding in which the parties express their consent, and that's all that's required.
Thank you. We've come to the end of our hour, and I would like to thank all of our speakers very much, particularly if I may say Professor Hopkins, for fielding all those questions with such skill and clarity. Thank you very much indeed.
Welcome.
Just a few notices from us. Normally, at this stage of the Zoom call, the last question would normally be put by Colin Blakely, the editor of the Church of England newspaper. And I don't know if everyone has caught up with the really sad news that he passed away very suddenly yesterday. And just to pay tribute to him on this call, he was a great supporter of ours and a regular attender at the Zoom calls, and we'll miss him very much. One further notice before we go, if I could just bring in Andrew Brown at this point. We've decided that these Zoom calls are going to go bi-weekly. We're going to have 2 a week from now on. The Tuesday one at 12 o'clock will always be on the main news story of the week. The Thursday one will be a series of In Conversation With episodes with the journalists who write for us at the Religion Media Centre. And this Thursday coming, Andrew Brown is in the chair. Andrew, I wonder if you would just in the closing moments just like to introduce your guest and tell us what the subject is, please.
Okay, I'm going to be talking with David Turfjell, who's a Swedish sociologist of religion, who has just published a really excellent, fascinating book about how nature has become the religion of the Swedes. And to some extent, this is true here too, that people now go out into the forests for the kind of spiritual refreshment and indeed the kind of perspective which traditionally they got in churches. Now, David's last book, The Godless People, was a really subtle and elegant study of how it is that Swedes, perhaps like British humanists, have beliefs that are almost indistinguishable in practice from Christianity, but are really, really offended if you say that. And that Christianity is something that other people do, even if their moral assumptions are still entirely formed by it. And this one, where you look at what happens when people go into the forests and go for long, spiritually refreshing walks, which is a very, very widespread pastime in Sweden, seems to me entirely fascinating, not least because when I ask Swedish Christian friends, they respond in exactly the same terms as Swedish secularist friends. You know, the kingdom of God is in the forest, said one of them, actually a priest. So I think people who are interested at all in secularization and in the sort of onrush of really hard to express feelings should all tune in at 1 o'clock on Thursday.
Thank you. And so I'll invite everyone on the call, speakers included, invite your friends, and I look forward to seeing you again. So thank you everybody for taking part today, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday and again Tuesday next week. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.